Please help him, a woman pleads to the 911 operator. Sandra Garner reports that a masked man has just shot her husband. A short time later, police arrive at a single-family home in Maypearl, Texas, hoping to apprehend the suspect. But inside the house are only the woman who made the 911 call and her dead husband. It is the beginning of a case that makes one doubt everything: the crime, the witnesses, and the woman who desperately called the police that night. Sandra and John Garner meet in 1998 in Paris, Texas, about a 2-hour drive from Dallas. At the time, they are both working for the same packaging company. Sandra is already separated from her first husband and is raising her 2 children on her own. John had only recently joined the company, but the two hit it off immediately, despite a 13-year age difference. Within just a few months, they became a couple. John made an effort early on to build a good relationship with Sandra's children. Those around them described the relationship as harmonious. Friends, family, and co-workers later report that Sandra and John were a loving, open-minded couple who were a perfect match. 2 years after meeting, the two marry in January 2001 in Las Vegas. Professionally, John's career takes off. He is promoted to manager at the company and continues to work there alongside Sandra. Among his employees, he is regarded as competent, friendly, and humorous. Later, however, some colleagues report that John treated certain employees with conspicuous harshness. Firing employees, in particular, seems to have given him a certain amount of pleasure. In social gatherings, he sometimes jokes about how easy it is for him to fire people. And there is another dark side to John. He is no stranger to alcohol, and when he drinks, he becomes loud and unpleasant. Over the years, his alcohol problems worsen. On top of that, he experiences depressive episodes during which he takes antidepressants. Despite John's issues, Sandra continues to seem happy by his side. But in 2014, Sandra receives a diagnosis that changes everything: multiple sclerosis. The chronic disease attacks the central nervous system and is incurable. John stands by her, accompanies her to doctor's appointments, takes over household chores, and tries to lighten her load. But Sandra finds it difficult to cope with the new reality. A few months after the diagnosis, she confesses to John that she no longer wants to live. John is shocked, but reacts calmly and with understanding. He tells her that he cannot live without her. After a long conversation, Sandra regains her will to live. In the following weeks, her relationship with her daughter Andrea even improves. Andrea had previously struggled with her mother's new relationship, but when she sees how hard John is trying and how he cares for Sandra, she accepts him as an integral part of her family. In 2016, Sandra and John decide to start a new chapter in their lives. They move to Maypearl, a small town with about 1,000 residents south of Dallas. There, they buy a large house with a garden and a pool, right across the street from John's parents, with whom Sandra has a good relationship. Their son Wes, who has already moved out, also lives nearby. Sandra feels at home in her new surroundings. She is surrounded by family and, despite health setbacks, begins to rediscover her zest for life. But the family's happiness does not last long. On January 1st, 2018, Sandra and John celebrate their 18th wedding anniversary with a dinner at home. John is 42 and Sandra is 55 at the time. Sandra's son Wes visits in the early evening and drives home around 7 p.m. Sandra and John spend the rest of the evening together and go to bed around 9:30 p.m. But something terrible happens during the night. Shortly before 1 a.m., Sandra calls the emergency dispatch center in a panicked voice. She says a masked man broke into the house and shot John twice. She is in the bathroom, can hear that John is still breathing, but doesn't dare to go out. Despite Sandra's dramatic account, it takes a full 15 minutes for the police and emergency medical services to arrive at the house. The police enter the house with their weapons drawn, as they assume the perpetrator is still on the premises. But inside the building, they find only a completely distraught Sandra. In the bedroom, the emergency responders discover John. The paramedic notes that his body is still warm. However, he has since died from his injuries. At the time of the call, he may still have been alive. The police begin collecting evidence that very night. However, they use questionable methods. The first crime scene photos are taken with the officers' cell phones. Meanwhile, Sandra is taken to the police station. She is required to remove her clothing for examination and provide fingerprints. Around 2 a.m., an official interrogation begins, which is recorded. Sandra reports that she was awakened by 2 loud bangs. Shortly after, she smelled gunpowder, and suddenly a flashlight was shown in her face. She saw a masked man in her bedroom, taller than her, wearing a hoodie, sweater, and jeans. Sandra says she fell to the floor screaming and begged the man not to shoot her. The man told her, "What I came here to do is done. I didn't come to shoot you." He explained that he had come because of John, since John had fired him. As a result, he had lost his family, his house, and everything else. He demanded money and went with her to the office to the safe. When she turned on the light, she was able to look him in the eyes briefly, whereupon he pointed the gun at her and threatened to shoot her if she looked at him again. She then gave him all the cash from the safe, according to her own account, about $18,000. The man then shoved her into the bathroom and ordered her to count to 100 before she was allowed to call the police. Sandra followed the instructions and then dialed 911. The questioning ends around 4 a.m. Afterward, Sandra is taken back home. Although John's parents live directly across the street, she refuses to stay with them. She returns to her own home and tells the police as they leave that she hopes the perpetrator comes back, because then she would shoot him. Early in the morning, Sandra's son Wes goes directly to the police. He does not go to his mother, but to the police station, where he explains that he is convinced his mother had something to do with his stepfather's death. He does not want to give any details, but urges the police to thoroughly investigate his mother. He finds it particularly strange that the 2 guard dogs at the house did not bark during the night. The police take his statement, but remain cautious for the time being. Sandra's account seemed credible to them. The next day, the investigators search the house again, including the garage and both vehicles. Inside the house, they discover over 10 firearms, all legally acquired. But it is striking that the weapons are scattered unsecured throughout the house, under the bed, in the closet, or on the kitchen counter. And one of the weapons is missing: Sandra's revolver, a gift from John. She says she doesn't know where the gun is. The police then seize all electronic devices, including cell phones, tablets, and laptops. The next day, the results of the gunshot residue analysis are in. Sandra had gunshot residue on both hands. However, this does not automatically mean that she fired the gun, as the residue could have gotten on her hands simply from being near the shots or from performing CPR. There is no conclusive evidence, but several pieces of circumstantial evidence cast doubt on Sandra's innocence. 3 days after the crime, another incriminating piece of evidence comes to light. The forensic examination of Sandra's laptop reveals 2 Google searches she conducted just 4 days before John's death. The first is, "How to kill someone in their sleep," and the second is, "16 ways to kill someone without getting caught." These findings shed new light on the case, but they are not yet sufficient for the police to make an arrest or file charges. A few days after the discovery of the suspicious Google searches, Sandra's son Wes contacts the police again. He says they should take a closer look at his mother's red Ford Mustang. Wes states that Sandra told him a few months ago that she usually keeps her gun in the car. The police then drive to Sandra's house again. The officers learn that Sandra is staying with her in-laws across the street. They go there and ask her to open the garage. Sandra reacts angrily, refuses entry, and tells the officers to leave. But the officers now have a valid search warrant. The officers search the red Mustang and discover a black plastic bag under the passenger seat. Inside, they find the missing gun, wrapped in wet towels and additionally packed in a plastic bag. Sandra denies having hidden the gun there. The police also wonder whether it was really Sandra who placed the gun there. The burglar wouldn't have had the time or the means to do it. But who else could it have been, if not Sandra? Some suspect that her son Wes might have placed the gun there, since his tip was what put the police on the right track in the first place. However, since this is pure speculation, it is not pursued further. The forensic examination ultimately reveals that the seized weapon is the murder weapon. However, no DNA traces or fingerprints are found on it. Furthermore, the investigators forgot to check the vehicle's door handles for fingerprints. Sandra is nevertheless summoned for questioning again, but this time not as a witness, but as an official suspect. The second interrogation is significantly more confrontational. The investigators directly confront Sandra with the accusation that she shot her husband. She sticks to her previous account that a masked stranger broke into the house and shot John out of revenge. To some investigators, she seems cold-hearted. To others, her steadfastness speaks to her credibility. In the end, no answer can be found to the question of whether Sandra is an exceptionally good actress or is telling the truth. Eventually, Sandra Garner is arrested. Bail is set at $2 million. She must spend a year and a half in pretrial detention. During this time, she loses most of her social circle. Many acquaintances and former friends distance themselves from her, and even her husband's family turns their backs on her. Sandra Garner's trial begins in September 2019. The prosecution presents a series of pieces of circumstantial evidence: the gunshot residue on her hands, the incriminating testimony of her son Wes, the murder weapon that disappeared and then reappeared, and the Google searches she conducted shortly before the murder. Her refusal to voluntarily open the garage is also portrayed as suspicious. The defense counters that none of these elements constitute conclusive evidence. There are no DNA traces or fingerprints on the murder weapon. Her son's testimony should also be viewed with caution. He incriminated his mother immediately after the crime, without providing concrete evidence or a clear motive. Furthermore, Wes was in the house at the time of the Google searches. At that hour, Sandra and John would typically already have been asleep. Sandra herself, however, claims that she Googled how she could kill herself. A central element of the trial is the question of motive. The defense argues that there is no apparent reason why Sandra would have killed her husband. Friends and family members confirm that the marriage was considered harmonious, especially after Sandra's illness. Sandra herself insists repeatedly that she loved John. In contrast, the defense points to a possible motive involving her son Wes. He believed he would inherit after John's death. However, this assumption was incorrect. John had not included Wes in his will. The defense nevertheless questions whether Wes himself deliberately placed the gun in the car and conducted the Google searches to deliberately shift suspicion onto his mother. Wes, however, initially has an alibi. He says he was at home watching Netflix, and his streaming data confirms that the service was used continuously starting at 8:30 p.m. But later, it turns out that the stored times were set to a different time zone. The alibi is thus invalid. Due to a lack of evidence, Wes is nevertheless not considered a suspect. The theory of a masked perpetrator is also ruled out by the police. There are no signs of forced entry, no foreign DNA. Furthermore, the prosecution argues that a premeditated perpetrator would have brought his own weapon. The prosecution stands by its assessment that Sandra murdered her husband. For them, the case is clear-cut. The defense repeatedly points out significant oversights on the part of the investigators. The first crime scene photos were taken with personal cell phones and were not archived later. Some officers were in the house without protective gear. The lead investigator had never handled a murder case before, and according to the defense, his mistakes meant that the results of the investigation were of little value. After a month-long trial, 25 witnesses, and 400 pieces of evidence presented, the jury retires to deliberate. Just 6 hours later, the verdict is reached. Sandra Garner is acquitted. The acquittal is based on the principle of in doubt for the defendant. John's family is stunned. To them, it is clear that Sandra is guilty. 2 days after the verdict, Sandra is released from pretrial detention. Her daughter Andrea and some friends pick her up. She has had no contact with her son Wes since the crime. In interviews, Sandra later says that she now believes Wes was the masked man who shot John. If that is the case, the question remains as to why Sandra did not recognize her son by his voice or his behavior. The case remains unsolved to this day. Despite numerous clues, evidence, and statements, no one has been convicted of the crime. Even though the case is legally closed, it remains unresolved for John's family. And to this day, they hope that the case will be reopened someday. That brings us to the end of today's video. Who do you think murdered John Garner? Was it his wife Sandra, his stepson Wes, or an unknown burglar? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. That's also a great way to support this channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications. Other than that, there isn't much else to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever time you're watching this, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.